The cider in my mug had gone flat and warm, and I hadn't taken a sip in 20 minutes, but I kept holding it because my hands needed something to do. I was standing near the back of the private dining room at our flagship restaurant, the one with the long reclaimed oak table my father loved to seat 30 people at, and I was watching him slide a folder across that table toward my brother, like he was handing over a crown. The room was full. Investors who put money into us years ago, the regional managers, a food writer from the Columbus paper, two of my aunts, a cousin I'm pretty sure I'd last seen at a funeral, and Cole, my brother, sitting at the head of the table in a blazer that still had the fold lines from the box. My father, Roy, stood beside him with one hand on Cole's shoulder, beaming the way I had spent most of my life trying to make him beam at me. He had a pen ready, not just any pen, the heavy fountain pen I bought him 3 Christmases ago. The one he kept in a drawer and only took out when he wanted a moment to feel important. He uncapped it and told the room that as of today he was transferring full control of Holloway Hospitality Group, the company I had pulled back from the edge of a cliff over the last 9 years, to his son. He said his voice was thick, that the business deserved someone with vision, someone who could carry the name forward. Cole stood, buttoned that stiff blazer, and accepted the applause like a man who'd been practicing the gesture in a mirror. His wife clapped with her whole arms. She had on a coat that cost more than what we paid a line cook in a month. I didn't clap. I didn't say anything. I didn't even change my face. I just watched my father grin at my brother in a way he had never once grinned at me, and I let him sign, because none of them knew. Not one person in that room understood that the paper he was so proud of, the paper Cole was already folding into his breast pocket like a deed, was about as binding as a placemat. Before I tell you the rest of it, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Leave a town in the comments. It helps me picture who's out there. My name is Nora. I'm 33. To my family, I'm the responsible one, which in our house was never a compliment. It meant the one who didn't need anything. The one you could overlook because she'd handle it anyway. But to the 11 people who held minority stakes in Holloway Hospitality Group, and to the bank that financed our expansion, and to the attorney sitting quietly in the corner of that dining room with a leather folder on her lap, I was the majority owner, the managing member, and the person who had personally signed off on every profitable quarter we'd had since 2018. My father opened the first Holloway's in 1991, one restaurant, a diner really, off a state route outside Columbus, with final booths and a pie case and a reputation for the kind of meatloaf people drove out of their way for. By the time I came back in 2015, with a finance degree and 2 years at a restaurant group in Chicago, that single location had become 4, and all 4 were quietly drowning. Food costs out of control. Vendor contracts nobody had renegotiated since the Bush administration. A bookkeeping system that was, and I am being generous, a shoebox. My father gave me a title that meant nothing, operations coordinator, and a desk in a storage room that still smelled like fryer oil, and he told me to make myself useful. So I did. I spent the first 18 months learning where every dollar went, and more importantly, where every dollar leaked. I renegotiated our produce and protein contracts and cut our food cost by 9 points. I brought in an inventory system that ended the practice of ordering by gut feeling. I closed the one location that was never going to be saved and used the lease buyout to renovate the 2 that could. I hired a real chef to standardize the menu across the group and a controller who knew what a P&L was. By 2018, for the first time in years, we were making money on every plate we sold. My father shook my hand at the staff Christmas party and told me, in front of everyone, "Good work, kiddo." That same night, he handed Cole an envelope of cash and called him the future of the family. I'd be lying if I said that didn't land somewhere deep. It did. I remember sitting in my car in the gravel lot behind the flagship after that party, engine running for the heat, telling myself the work mattered even if he couldn't see it. That building something real was its own reward. That eventually he'd understand. I believed that a lot longer than a sensible person should have. Cole had drifted through every job my father ever invented for him. Director of Brand. VP of Guest Experience. Titles with no teeth, because accountability was always optional when your last name was painted on the sign. He'd skip the manager meetings, He once let a catering contract with the county fairgrounds, a real account, fall apart because he didn't return 3 voicemails over 2 weeks. He expensed a long weekend in Scottsdale as a site visit for concept development. I found it during a routine reconciliation and brought it to my father. My father told me to leave it alone. So I left it alone. What I did not leave alone was my own education. I was getting an executive MBA 2 nights a week at a state school an hour away. I was reading our operating agreement on weekends until I understood it better than the lawyer who drafted the first version. I was getting to know our minority members, the early investors, the couple who'd put in money for the second location back in the 90s, the regional bank officer who'd known my father for 30 years. I wasn't working an angle. I was just there, reliable, the one who answered the phone, who had the numbers ready, who remembered people's kids' names, the kind of person you trust when something actually matters. In the spring of 2021, my father had a health scare. Not a heart attack, but close enough, an arrhythmia that put him in the hospital overnight and rattled him in a way I'd never seen. I sat in that hospital room with him for the better part of an evening, and we talked, really talked, for the first time in years. About the company, about what came next. He held my hand and told me he was proud of what I'd done with the business, that he knew deep down that I was the reason it was still standing, and then, in the same breath, he told me he was going to leave it to Cole. He said people in this industry, the suppliers, the bankers, the old guard restaurant families would take a man more seriously. He said it gently, like he was protecting me from a disappointment, like he was sparing me a burden. He said it like a gift. I drove home that night on the dark stretch of Route 33, and somewhere around the river I stopped being sad about it. I'd spent 6 years waiting to be chosen. That night I decided I was done waiting. I was going to build a position no one could take away from me. Not with a speech, not with a folder, not with a fountain pen. Over the next 2.5 years I bought in, quietly, legally, one piece at a time. When the couple who'd backed the second restaurant wanted to retire to Arizona and cash out, I bought their units at a fair, independently appraised price. When an old family friend's estate needed to liquidate his stake, I bought that too. I used my savings. I refinanced the duplex I'd bought in 2019. I took an SBA-backed loan against my own credit, in my own name. And I did not tell a soul in my family because not one of them ever asked what I did with my money. My attorney, Diane, was 61 years old and ran a small firm out of a converted house downtown, and she was meticulous. Every purchase was documented. Every transfer was recorded in the company's membership ledger exactly the way our operating agreement required. The same agreement I had helped rewrite in 2019, the one that spelled out in plain language how ownership changes had to be reported and where that record lived. Nobody in my family ever opened that ledger. Why would they? Maintaining it was my job. I was the managing member. I kept the books, I filed the reports, I sent the annual notices that everyone signed without reading because they trusted me to handle the boring parts. My father trusted me to mind the details. He trusted Cole to inherit the reward. That was the math of our family, and I had finally learned how to do it. By last fall, I held 52% of Holloway Hospitality Group. I was the majority owner of the company my father was planning to give away. The dinner was his idea. The whole production, the private room, the investors, the food writer, the family, weeks of planning. He wanted a moment for Cole. He wanted ceremony. I'd known about it for almost a month. Diane was in the corner with the full ledger in her folder. We had gone over how this would go, twice, sitting at her kitchen table with cold coffee, because I did not want a single thing about it to feel like an ambush, even though, technically, it was one. I watched Cole work the room before the announcement, shaking hands, accepting congratulations that hadn't been earned yet, already wearing the part. His wife kept her hand on his back the whole time, steering him, beaming. My father found my eyes across the room and gave me a small nod. I knew that nod. It meant be gracious. It meant don't make this about you. It meant smile for your brother. I gave it back to him. He had no idea what was sitting in that leather folder 8 feet away from him. I had decided in advance that I would not raise my voice. I'd watched my family long enough to know that a woman who gets loud in a room full of men becomes the problem, becomes the story everyone tells afterward. I was not going to be the story. I was going to let the paperwork talk. So when the applause settled and my father was still standing there glowing, Diane stood up. She's not a tall woman, and she doesn't raise her voice either, but there's a particular stillness to someone who spent 30 years in rooms like that, and people quieted down to look at her. "Forgive the interruption," she said. "Before this transition is finalized, there's a procedural matter the group needs to be aware of." My father's smile flickered. He looked at me. I looked at my cider. Diane walked to the table and set a bound document down in front of Cole and my father. "This is the current membership ledger for Holloway Hospitality Group, LLC, she said. "It has been maintained and filed in accordance with the company's operating agreement. I direct your attention to the third page." Nobody moved. Then my father reached for it. His readers were in his shirt pocket, and his hands weren't quite steady getting them on. He turned to the third page. I watched his face. I have spent more than 30 years reading my father's face, and I watched it go through the whole sequence, the squint, then the math, then a thing I'd never once seen him aim at me. Real reckoning. "Cole," he said. "Cole, come look at this." Cole leaned over his shoulder. He read it. He read it again, slower. "What is this supposed to be?" he said. "Not a question, more like a dare." "It's the membership ledger," Diane said. "As of October of last year, Nora Holloway holds 52% of the membership units in Holloway Hospitality Group. She is the majority owner of the company." Cole straightened up. He looked at me. I held his eyes and kept my face exactly where it was because I had nothing to prove with it. "That's not possible," he said. His voice was still under control, but I could hear the place where it was about to give out. "It is not only possible," Diane said. "It's a matter of record. Every transfer was appraised, documented, and entered into the ledger, which has been available to any member of this company upon request for the past 2 years. She paused. No one requested it, and there it was, the silence. The specific kind that happens when a room full of people realizes all at once that they've been reading the wrong page the whole time. The investors in the back weren't surprised. The bank officer, a man named Frank who'd financed our second renovation and had known my father since they coached Little League together, folded his hands on the table and waited. He'd read the ledger. He was the only one who had. My father set the document down very carefully. He took his readers off. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, and when he lowered them, the ceremony had drained right out of his face. He looked like a man who'd walked into the wrong house and was only now noticing the furniture didn't match. He asked me when. I told him the first purchase was the summer of 2022. He asked me why I never said anything. I told him I had maintained the ledger exactly as the operating agreement required, and that the information had been sitting there, available for anyone who cared to look. He understood the part I wasn't saying out loud. He looked down at the fountain pen still in his hand, my gift, my money, and he set it on the table next to the folder like it had gotten too heavy. "Nora," he said, and then nothing. He didn't have the next words. He'd spent 2 years rehearsing the wrong speech. Cole found his voice first, the way he always did. He said this was a stab in the back. He said I'd gone behind Dad's back. He said I'd schemed, that I'd manipulated everyone. He was getting louder, and the room was watching him get louder, and I let him. I let him stand there in front of 30 people and accuse me of betrayal for buying units on the open market at fair value, with full disclosure. Over the course of 2 years, I let him say the word manipulated in a room full of investors who had watched me rebuild the very thing he thought he was about to inherit. I have never in my life been so glad to stay quiet. When he finally ran out, I spoke. I kept my voice level. I said I hadn't gone behind anyone's back. I said every purchase was appraised, recorded, and disclosed, and that the operating agreement, the one Cole had never read, but which I had helped write in 2019, laid out exactly how ownership transfers were to be reported. I'd followed it to the comma. And then I said the part I hadn't planned, the part that came up out of some place I usually keep the lid on. I said that for 9 years I had rebuilt this company. I'd cut the food costs and renegotiated the contracts and closed the location that was bleeding us and hired the people who actually knew what they were doing. I'd worked Thanksgivings and missed my own birthday more than once and driven this group from losing money on every plate to a $3.4 million net last year. I had done all of it without being asked and without being thanked and without once being offered the chair that was apparently always available as long as the person sitting in it was named Cole. I said I'd stopped waiting to be handed something I had already earned. I said I'd bought it instead. The room was dead quiet. Frank, the bank officer, uncrossed and recrossed his hands and looked like a man working very hard not to smile. My father stood up. He walked over to the window that looked out on the gravel lot, the same lot where I'd sat in my car after that Christmas party years ago, telling myself good work was enough. He stood there with his back to all of us for a long time. Cole was still going, but I'd stopped hearing him. I was watching the way my father's shoulders had come down, the way the whole performance of the evening had left his body. He turned around. He said, quietly, that he needed to understand exactly what this meant, legally. Diane laid it out without any drama. The transfer document he'd just signed had no legal force. You cannot hand operational control of a company to a minority member over the objection of the majority owner. The paper Cole had folded into his pocket was symbolic, nothing more. He'd accepted a title that didn't exist. My father asked if there was any way to undo my purchases. Diane said plainly that absent fraud or a breach of duty, and she let that hang for a beat, there was no legal basis to reverse anything. The transactions were clean. I had done nothing wrong. He nodded, slow. He picked the transfer document back up off the table, the one he'd signed with my pen in front of 30 people, and he looked at it for a moment, and then he set it back down like it had stopped meaning anything to him. He said he needed a minute. He walked out of the room. Cole turned to me. His wife had her hand on his arm again, but it wasn't a proud hand anymore. It was a restraining one. He told me I'd humiliated the family. He told me I'd done all of this to hurt him. I told him I'd done it to protect what I built. He told me I was unbelievable. I told him he was right and that he'd had 9 years to notice, and he hadn't used a single one of them. Diane caught my eye and gave me a small look that I'd learned meant let it sit, so I stopped. I let the room hold it. The investors had started murmuring among themselves. Frank stood up, came around the table and shook my hand and said, "Congratulations, Nora," and the word landed in that room like the first warm afternoon after a hard winter. A couple of the others followed him. Cole watched it happen, and I watched him watch it, and I understood that this was the real handover, not the folder, not the units, the room turning toward me. That was the thing my father had actually been trying to give Cole, and it had never been his to give. My father came back about 20 minutes later. The ceremony was gone from him completely. He didn't sit at the head of the table. He pulled out a chair in the middle, like a regular guest, and he sat down like a man who needed to think with his whole body. He asked me almost shy what I wanted to do with the company. I told him I wanted to take it to the next level. He let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, the kind that escapes when something is too exactly ironic to hold in. He asked if I had a plan. I opened my laptop. I had a deck I'd built 6 months earlier, a 3-year growth plan, 2 acquisition targets, a fast casual spin-off concept we could franchise, the financing already mapped. I'd been ready for this for a long time. He watched the whole thing without a word. When I finished, he said it was thorough. I told him I knew. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, simply, that he hadn't seen it. He said he'd looked at me and seen someone who was good with details, and looked at Cole and seen someone who reminded him of himself at that age, and that he'd made the oldest mistake a man in his position can make. He didn't dress it up. He didn't ask me to feel sorry for him. He just said it. I sat with that one for a minute. Cole left before the meeting was over. His wife went after him, her heels going down the hall in quick, furious little strikes, and I heard the front door of the restaurant open and shut. I stayed. I stayed another 3 hours, going through the transition timeline and the operating plan with Diane and Frank and two of the other members and my father, who sat across from me and took part in every piece of it like a man, quietly doing penance. He didn't perform anything that night. He didn't make it about himself. He just listened and asked good questions and agreed to the steps Diane outlined. Here's the part I want to be honest about, because the comments on my last story asked what happened to people afterward, and I think people deserve the rest of it. Cole didn't vanish. He kept his VP of Guest Experience title for about 4 months, until the day he tried to override a vendor decision, and the vendor called me directly to confirm, because everyone in our supply chain had figured out who actually ran the company. After that, he stopped coming in. He took a sales job at a restaurant equipment distributor, 2 states over. We text on birthdays. It's polite and it's thin, and I've made my peace with it being that way. His wife stopped speaking to me entirely, which, given the coat, I survive. When it was finally over that night and the room had emptied out, my father asked if we could get dinner sometime that week. I said I had a lot to wrap up. He said of course. He stood up to go, and at the door he turned and said my name. Just my name, nothing on the end of it. I think he was reaching for something he didn't have the words for yet. I told him I'd call him, and I meant it. Not because 9 years of being looked past dissolves in one evening, because it doesn't, but because I'm a person who understands a balance sheet, and I know the difference between a debt that can never be paid and one that somebody is finally actually trying to settle. I drove home that night on the same roads I'd been driving for 9 years. Route 33, the river, the dark. The town looked exactly the same. My phone had 14 unread messages by the time I pulled into my driveway. Cole, his wife, 2 cousins, an aunt I hadn't heard from in years, who suddenly have thoughts about family loyalty. I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat. I sat in the car for a minute with the engine off. In the same kind of dark I'd sat in years ago, telling myself that being unseen was just my lot, that the dignified thing to do when you're overlooked is to shrink quietly and keep working. I thought about that version of me, and I thought about the night on the river road when I decided she was wrong. I didn't feel like celebrating. Celebration is loud, and I was so tired of being loud in a frequency nobody in my family could hear. What I felt was steadier than that, and heavier in a good way. The company was mine now in every way that counted, on paper, in practice, and out loud. I had stopped asking for permission to take up room I had already paid for. I went inside. I made myself eggs because it was late and I hadn't eaten. I answered 2 emails. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. And in the morning I got up and went in to run my company, the way I had been running it for years. The only thing that had changed was that now everybody knew it. I used to think being overlooked was something that happened to me, like weather. For years, I treated it as a fact about the world, instead of a choice other people were making, and that mistake cost me more than any bad contract ever did. The night my father Roy slid that folder toward Cole, I finally understood the real lesson, and it wasn't about winning. Nothing about Holloway hospitality landed in my lap by accident. The 52% came from 100 small choices nobody clapped for. The late reconciliations, the appraisals, the loan I signed alone, the ledger I kept honest, even when keeping it honest meant building the very record that would one day undo my own family's plan. What I want you to take from this isn't the payback, it's the order things have to happen in. I never falsified a single entry, never moved $1 in the dark, never bought a unit I couldn't prove I'd paid fair value for. When Cole shouted the word manipulated in front of 30 people, the reason it couldn't stick was that there was nothing underneath it. You cannot build something unshakable on a lie, because a lie is the crack that everything eventually falls through. The clean paperwork was my protection, and the only way to have clean paperwork is to be the kind of person who does the boring right thing when no one is checking. But being right wasn't enough on its own. Plenty of overlooked people are right and stay overlooked their whole lives. What changed my situation was learning how the actual machinery worked, the operating agreement, the membership ledger, the appraisal rules, the financing. I stopped hoping my father would suddenly see me and started understanding the system well enough that his seeing me became optional. Resentment is loud and useless. Understanding is quiet and it moves things. If you're sitting in your own version of that parking lot right now, telling yourself good work should be enough, I gently tell you what I wish someone had told me. Learn the rules of the room you're stuck in until you know them better than the people who are keeping you out. And then comes the hardest part, the part that took me almost 3 years. You have to keep going on a timeline. Nobody applauds. Through the quarters when it feels like nothing is changing, when the people you love still hand the chair to someone else. I bought those units one slow purchase at a time while my father planned a ceremony for my brother. I didn't get to feel triumphant during any of it. I just kept showing up. So I'm not telling you to scheme. I'm telling you to be honest, to get smart, and to outlast the version of yourself that wants to shrink. The company was always mine in the ways that mattered. I just stopped asking permission to take up the room I'd already paid for.